Hey guys, James here. Today we're going to be talking about my advice for beginners to the fantasy, science fiction genres, the genres, as I like to pompously call them. So I got a comment on my previous video, which is like a review of Consider Phlebas by Ian M. Banks, asking me for my recommendations for people that are sort of beginning or new to the fantasy sci-fi genre. And it's a video that I've seen from a lot of people before, and it's not one I've really considered doing myself because I think that it's such a weird thing. I don't know. I don't have a good perspective on it because, like, fantasy science fiction has sort of been my wheelhouse since I was a small child. And so my entry point into fantasy sci-fi were, like, books by Ian Colfer, who does the Artemis Fowl series. It's, fantasy and sci-fi, it's just sort of been something I read for a very long time. So I don't feel like I have anything really to say about recommendations for beginners because I don't think my path through reading these genres has been very beginner friendly. Like, I moved on when I was a teenager, I read the first Wheel of Time book like 6 times attempting to get through it. And I don't recommend doing that probably as a kid. But I mean, I guess I'm really mostly speaking to adults, hopefully, on this channel anyway. So I want to do something a bit differently. Just saying, what do I advise you do? Now, I think from my point of view, it's going to depend on you, really, and what your experience level is with fantasy sci-fi in other forms of media, as well as just books, as well as, where you're coming from. Like, are you someone who, like, why do you want to get into it? Is the question I feel you should really ask yourself when approaching this question. Like, obviously, people that ask, how do I get into fantasy science fiction, probably are wanting to get into it for one reason or another. And that's really going to the answer to that question is going to shape how you should approach the genre. What is it about fantasy science fiction that compels you, that makes you want to get into it? Is it just because you're reading, if you're listening to reviews from other people about books that you think, wow, that sounds really interesting, they're really excited about it, just read those books. It's a similar thing. Like, I was at one point fairly into reading comic books, like on a week by week issue, and the advice you would give to someone who was like, how do I get into reading Batman, for example? Like, you wouldn't tell that person, go and buy DC Comics, like, don't buy Detective Comics #1 somewhere. Like, find Detective Comics #1, the first ever Batman story, and read it chronologically from there. Because, like, first of all, the medium has evolved so much. The genre has changed so much. The characters have changed so much. If I were to advise someone, how do I get into reading comic books or whatever, like from a week by week basis, comic books come out monthly, I would just say, pick up the latest issue and go from there, mate. Because, and it's the same with fantasy and science fiction, in my opinion. Now, there are a few ways that you could approach it. Like, if you were like, I'm going to go back and read, I'm going to start with Lord of the Rings and work forward. I think that's probably not a good idea, because the classics, those books that are the super old books, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the 90s to an extent, they're a very different kettle of fish to how fantasy is now. Because when Tolkien was writing, he was writing almost in a fantasy vacuum, in terms of epic fantasy stories. He was there's a reason why people say modern fantasy started with Tolkien. It was the origin point, and as a result, it's very different to things that have been inspired by it. It's the same thing that happened when I sort of went back and read H.P. Lovecraft. Like, his storytelling was not the strongest, but like his influences have carried through, and things that have been influenced by his work, I feel, are stronger from like a modern storytelling point of view. So don't be afraid to just jump in, is my advice. You know, there are books now that are super popular. Like, I'm looking at The Name of the Wind that I've got sitting right here. Like, if you want to start with The Name of the Wind, I think good on you, mate. Like, if that's, it depends. Like, it all depends what you want. There are some things that I would say don't start with. Like, as much as it appeals to me specifically, I would not encourage people that have a low understand, like if they have a very limited understanding of fantasy tropes and stuff, I would not recommend starting with something like The Witcher, or like even something like Game of Thrones, really, because those two books really shine in the way they subvert tropes and stuff. So if you're not familiar with fantasy tropes and sci-fi tropes and whatever, approaching something that tries to take those tropes and twist it for effect is not going to resonate as strongly with you as someone who is very experienced with it. But sometimes you might approach this genre in a literary form and be very familiar with the way sort of fantasy goes. Fantasy TV and movies and stuff, like, these are stories as well as any book is. And they share the same sort of storytelling elements. So my advice, if you have found a show, like a sci-fi show or a fantasy show that you really love, look for an adaptation of it. Like, if you want to read A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin because you are hyper into Game of Thrones, the TV show, like if you got into this and you were like, oh, I want to like get into fantasy, by all means, pick up this book and start here. It's a fantastic book. Like, you know, really the story, but you know, you will get a lot out of it as a reader. And I think the books in fantasy sci-fi are often so different. Fantasy is one of those genres where you can really do anything with. So there's no real clear path through, like, building up. If you like say you're like looking, what kind of story are you looking for? That's really all it boils down to. If you want fantasy with like an action adventure kind of twist, then there are books for that. If you're looking for deep politics and magic systems and stuff, there's stuff for that. If you're a world building guy, there's stuff for that. There's character dramas. All this stuff takes place in the fantasy genre. Like, a genre is really just a collection of tropes, and don't get panicked by that. You know, I hear a lot of people, it's common with sci-fi, I think, more than fantasy for some reason. People are like, you know, oh, I'm worried that I won't understand all the technology and stuff and all the world building elements. Like, don't be concerned about that, is my advice to you. Like, if the story is done well, that stuff will come across perfectly fine on its own. You don't have to worry about it too much. It's all kind of just set dressing for a story. At the end of the day, if you're a reader who loves to read stories about characters, you'll be fine. Like, you know, you'll be absolutely fine. There are some books, obviously, like, not every book is going to be to everyone's taste. I found that with fantasy science fiction, but, you know, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't really matter. Like, the dressing is dressing. The heart, the meat and potatoes of fantasy and science fiction is the same as the meat and potatoes of any story, of any book, any work. You know, it's characters struggling against an obstacle to get their desire, their want, their need fulfilled. And I think that's something that everyone can really understand. So I would say, if there is a book that you've heard about that is fantasy and you're like, that sounds really good, go and pick that one up. if you have heard about something that you think sounds really good and then you read it and you're like, oh, this isn't really for me, don't knee jerk and blame the genre for that. Don't just say, oh, the fantasy's not for me. I don't understand all these wizards running around. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. There's plenty of fantasy on scales that's low fantasy, high fantasy, and everything in between. So it's really about just go in, experience what you have got in front of you, and decide if that's for you or not. And then if it's not, think about why that was. If you read Game of Thrones, for example, and you're like, this was like okay, but it wasn't really for me. Like, I love all the characters and stuff, but I wish there was more magic and stuff. Go and find books that people are recommending that have a more political bent, but potentially have more magic. It exists, If you want to read about dragons, go and look for recommendations on dragons. Like, as a genre, it's so hard because it's so wide to recommend, like, these are the books for beginners, baby's first fantasy. Like, it doesn't really exist unless you want to, like, go back and read books that are aimed at children, to sort of build up to it, because obviously those books will be simpler in terms of their characters and stuff and the world building, whatever. They're going to be easier to follow. But as an adult, you might not get as much out of it, and then that's going to lead to a whole other problem, isn't it? Like, I would never recommend someone to go and read, like, YA books if they don't normally read YA books anyway, because there's some reason that you don't read YA. If you're reading these contemporary literary novels or whatever, maybe something like The Name of the Wind that has more thematic stuff going on. Maybe that's going to be for you. It really, the summary is, it really just depends on who you are as a reader, where you've come from as a reader, and why you want to get into this genre in the first place. If you just want to read about a typical fantasy trope-like adventure because you've played Dungeons and Dragons for the first time and you want to read about this group of heroes or whatever, go and look up books. Like, just do a Google search, books with the fantasy adventure elements. There's thousands of books that are based around Dungeons and Dragons. Like, they just are, like, set in the universe of Dungeons and Dragons. So that might be a good starting point for you. It's all going to depend. So if you want to see a video where I, like, categorize fantasy books by like subgenres and little plot elements and details and stuff like that, let me know. Maybe I can do, like, top 5 books that have strong characters, like character-led books, or top 5 books that have bands of adventurers or whatever. Maybe I'll be able to do that. Maybe, I don't know. Like, my reading is not as wide as a lot of people's because I read relatively slowly. So maybe I won't be able to do, like, 5 books that are all about dragons, because I probably haven't read 5 books that's all about dragons, but whatever. Yeah, that's really it. That's all I wanted to say. Just a response to a comment that I'd been thinking about for a while, because I never understood. Like, a lot of the time you'll find when people are recommending, where do I start with fantasy or whatever, they choose books that they personally just, like, are their favourite books a lot of the time. I find, like, they're the books that they talk about all the time. A lot of people recommend, like, I really like Brandon Sanderson, you should start with Mistborn. Like, okay, I mean, that's great if you like Brandon Sanderson, but what if he's not for you? It's not great then, is it? So it really, like, again, it all really just depends. So go out there, if you're interested in the genre, just browse your bookshop, find something that you think sounds good to you, and give it a go. Don't be scared. It's not a big deal. Something I said in my Game of Thrones review as well, like, all of these plot, like, these world details and stuff, a lot of the time you can just sort of, if you just roll with it, just accept it for what it is. You don't have to understand the ins and outs of a magic system. You just sort of really have to understand what characters can do with it. in order to understand the story. Like, for example, in The Witcher, like you don't have to understand like that in the magic system works because they draw power from the natural elements of the world or whatever. You don't really have to understand that. You just have to sort of understand that in this world, witches and wizards can do magic that does stuff. You know, and like even with like complicated magic systems, like with Mistborn, there's a lot of detail put into how they consume different metals, and that gives them different kinds of powers and stuff. You don't really have to understand the ins and outs of everything about that magic system to know that if this character does this thing, they will then be able to do this thing. You know, it's not that complicated. And if you do find it complicated, just brush it aside. Even big epic fantasy books, like Wheel of Time, for example, it has some ridiculous number of named characters, like over 1,000 named characters. But you'll find that reading through books that are like that with a lot of named characters, it will come to you in time which are the important characters that you really kind of have to pay attention to, and which ones are just there as extras, basically. And that's like a world building thing. Like it happens a lot in fantasy science fiction where there's loads of characters because they're trying to create a more immersive world. And it's like the story of Game of Thrones, for example. In the original one, it can really be boiled down to the points of view of like 7 characters. There's like 7 main characters that you really need to kind of know about, and everyone they interact with is just kind of set dressing. Like some of them become more important than others, but you know, you don't have to keep track of every tiny name and every tiny movement of every person. That's sort of like what intimidates people, I think, with a lot of fantasy science fiction stuff. Like even with something like Consider Phoebus. No, I talked about this in my review as well. Like there are like 15 characters introduced right at the start of Consider Phoebus, but about 2 of them are really important to the story in any way. The other ones are sort of just there and can be safely forgotten about. You can just sort of lump them together in your mind and go, okay, he is a person who is on the crew of this ship. And just leave it at that. Just like, and you don't have to know all the different, like, all the details will come to you. The more you immerse yourself in it, the more you read it, you will slowly begin to build up your knowledge and understanding of it. So don't be put off by a steep learning curve. Just take it as it comes, 1 page at a time. That's it. So that's it. My advice on getting into fantasy science fiction for people that maybe haven't done so but do want to. Let me know if you like this video. If you have any tips for people that are going into fantasy sci-fi for the first time, and share with me your story of like the first time you tried to get into this genre and what that experience was like for you. And I will see you in the next video. The light is going down now, as you can see. We're a bit darker than we started in this video. So that's it. Like, comment, subscribe, all the rest of it, and I will see you in the future. Bye for now.